Alex, we're going to begin a discussion that's a sizable topic, and I'm sure this will carry on over a few more discussions. But we're going to begin today with an examination, let's say, of the Church of England in particular, perhaps set within a wider context. We'll see where we go. And as I say those words, I'm sure anybody listening or watching will bring to mind a litany of specific issues that the church in their minds will have got wrong. And rather than necessarily nitpicking our way through the details, I think what we're hoping to get to today are the connections between those things and indeed the influences behind them. So I might say where better to start than with Justin Welby, who, although has somewhat gracelessly now fallen on his sword, or at least his crook, he was interviewed by the BBC earlier in the year, and in expressing his sorrow, or at least his regret for some of the things that he believes he didn't handle too well, he said, if you want perfect leaders, you won't have any leaders. Now, what do you think he was hoping we would take from that?
I think, Charles, that Welby was hoping that we would continue to see the Church of England in the way that he and many of the bishops he has seen promoted or encouraged to get promoted would like to see the Church of England and would like us to see it, namely that it is just another core national institution with the same kind of strategy, forecasting, and business as anyone else. I mean, we could take this question of leadership in any particular direction, but it's a very secularized, contemporary, forward looking way of saying nobody's perfect, Gov, or we all have our foibles, or with a nod towards the alleged Christian mission of the Church of England, he was saying we are all sinners, but okay, to give him his due, Welby probably correctly thought that people are so jaded at this point with him in general, particular, the church in general, Christianity, not even more generally, that they didn't want to hear words like sinner intoned by Welby falling on his sword because it would seem like a hollow piety. But we could take this a little further. I'll give you the decision on where we go with this, but I'll just say that it is an intensely personal matter for me, this idea of whether the Church of England or other Christian denominations exist to furnish people with leadership, and if so, which people. Let's start with the words of the founder and head of the church, Jesus Christ himself, who told Peter, according to one section of the church, but not the Church of England, Peter was the first pope. But in any case, the spokesman of the apostles in that first generation, after his restoration from his fall at the end of the Gospel according to John, and in his turn also Peter tells other Christian elders, in modern terms clergy, this in his own epistles, their job is to feed the flock. And it's a very simple point, almost facile, but one that needs making, that the church exists for its own members in an earthly sense. I'm not trying to contrast that with glorifying God or being in Christ. I'm saying that if you're wanting to answer the question, uh, for whose benefit should the clergy, to use today's terminology, the leaders of the church, be thinking and doing and sacrificing, it is emphatically for the flock they've got. Now, in the particular case of the Church of England, that means, let's cut to the caricatures, but many is the word of truth in them. This means the half dozen grannies you have in your parish church of a Sunday morning at Matins or Eucharist are the people for whom the clergy are to think and act and self sacrifice and speak inspiringly and truthfully and comfortingly. It is not, no matter what kind of churchmanship, that is, style of belief of how to be a clergyman, no matter what the churchmanship is, no Church of England clergy person is biblically or historically free to say, but I feel called to the whole parish. Well, we could unpack these ideas later, but that is the core error that you've made straight away if you talk about leadership. I mean, I could get into later how I had more than a trifling chance of having been the Archbishop of Canterbury myself if I'd taken a completely different path in life in my early 20s. That might sound startling, but genuinely, I think I could have been, or any other of the lads in the same social circles as me. We could get into the hijacking of the Church of England by certain interest groups, but that's why it's personal to me. And just the final thing I'll say in this opening response is the first thing I did after graduating from Cambridge 20 years after Welby was one of the leading lights of the CICU, the Cambridge Intercollegiate Christian Union there. That's the oldest student Christian union in the whole world. The first thing I did was I went out to the former Soviet Union, where I was astonished to see that in both Russian and the local languages of the former Soviet Union, this calqued word leadership was being borrowed into Russian and the other languages out there and was not known in general discourse, but was very much a buzzword in the evangelical churches there, not even the local Orthodox or Catholic churches, but the evangelical churches had suddenly imbibed overnight from Anglo American evangelicalism in its various guises that the thing to do was to be a leader. So there's a few strands to get us going. It's not a historical concept, leadership in the church.
Well, there's so many great points that we will pick up on as we go. I think the bit that I'd like to get to is the link between your description of a congregation, which of course is absolutely accurate for a vast number of churches now, which is a couple of old grannies making up the congregation. But of course, you and I, being of similar age and background, have been through a childhood that certainly, I mean, unless you would differ, but which involved being in churches where there were absolutely more than a few grannies there. There are notable exceptions now, I think, in urban areas where there are swelling congregations, particularly of younger folk, and that's all well and good. But what is it that connects the dwindling congregations with the sorts of things that we could point to in terms of church policy, or indeed the misguided approach to the very subject of leadership in the first place? There's no ignoring that correlation between society, apparently en masse, but certainly by community, in effect turning away from the church. How do you look at that? And I mean, is it possible to go back to a particular point or a series of points at which that started to change?
We certainly can pinpoint a few, and I think viewers, I hope, will bear with me if I give a little historical detail because it is one of my specialist subjects. I have translated a fair amount, like whole magnum opuses of major church historians on how the Church of England is similar and how it differs from other established churches in Europe in the crucial period. That's the early modern era. So I'll try not to give a whole thesis here, but I think it is necessary to do so because even very clued up viewers that we may have in other English speaking countries, even Australia, which is the most similar when it comes to understanding Anglicanism to what you find in England and the particular brand of evangelical Anglicanism that's until very recently made that nation in Australia so vigorous. Um, if you're talking to even those very well clued up viewers, you will find that they don't quite get it. I mean, I've heard American clergymen who have been explaining their close links with the British churches to their congregations back home in the States, saying to the very clued up, historically literate people in the churches in America, you guys don't get it unless you've been over to England and lived there, just how fundamental this dichotomy is in English Christianity between Anglicanism and nonconformity. We don't want to give a whole history lecture on that. But it really is, even more than in other European countries that historically had a state endorsed or established church, it is the bedrock of what went on. I mean, I could take a snapshot of almost every century, but that would be far too much. Suffice to say that the early church, even the very institutionalized kind in what you might call early Roman Catholicism, um, did understand that the believers in Christ in any locality formed the congregation. And even at the height of medieval papal absolutism, that was something that, to give Roman Catholicism its credit to this day, is still acknowledged. But that runs in tandem with such a thing as canon law. That is how the church governs itself. Now, here we have to be very specific already. Because if you look at Magna Carta, well understood by many of our viewers and listeners, what are the institutions right there in the early 13th century which are already strong enough in the English establishment, that which you and I recently went through as well in our various ways? Which are the ones which are strong enough to say towards what is becoming the House of Lords, the backbone of Parliament, hey, well, you're rejecting royal absolutism, but you can't interfere with our ancient privileges. They are the City of London, the beginning of the banking world, that is, of course, and they are the Church. But before, during, and after the Reformation, and this will surprise a lot of our viewers, even if they're clued up, the Church, in that legal definition and the scope of operation of canon law, it's not ambiguous if you talk to any proper church lawyers, such as the legal advisors to a particular diocese. That means the clergy. No one else is either bound by canon law or enjoys the privileges at law of being the church. No one else is governed by, first of all, the Parliament of the United Kingdom, and then since 100 years ago, effectively the Synod, but it's still kept at arm's length from Parliament. It's one of the few duties that Parliament in Westminster still has and is very keen to get rid of. So that's a bit of a starting point. There are so many more points. I'll just take a couple. During the Reformation, many people who like to cock a snook, not just Roman Catholics, but other people like cynics about religion, will say, oh, well, this was just Henry VIII who founded this church on nothing, on his own marital requirements. Uh, if you look at a three-part series which I did interviewing my father, which you'll find on ukcolumn.org simply by searching for literacy in the search bar, and I'm sure you'll be able to link them to this piece, you will see my father's painstaking case that while it's true that there were politics going on, what made the Church of England unique among European Reformation models was that there was very much a groundswell, as in Germany, a bottom up. Lots and lots of what you might call emergent middle class or mercantilist people who could read and had time and who could see that there was a need for as they saw it, a split with the tyranny of Rome, but also a rethinking in a biblical sense of what the church was. Precisely over this point, is the church a body of believers that's visible, or is it the whole of society that's been Christianized, that's been christened sometimes by force, but it was a reality? Then, as you go through, I mean, the term Anglicanism, by universal historical consensus, doesn't really get going till a good century after the English Reformation and a bit longer, really till the mid 17th century, the time of Archbishop Laud and the Civil War and the subsequent intolerance of Puritanism that follows. All of these might sound a long way away from the experience of people listening if they're not engrossed in church history. But the point is, at every moment here, you've got the establishment, the archbishops, the bishops, but also the secular establishment, parliament, courts, the crown, especially the people hanging onto the crown invisibly, like the Privy Council, they are always saying, well, the church is part of our power structure. And compared with our continental nearest cousins, the Germans, Dutch, Scandinavians, who went to either the Lutheran or the Calvinist model, we have in the English model, even distinct from Scotland, we have this unique settlement under Queen Elizabeth, where she said that she did not wish to make windows into men's souls. In other words, and this was repeated during the Williamite Revolution, the Glorious Revolution at the end of the 17th century, there was an act of toleration, not of complete freedom of religion. The idea was we will deliberately blur from henceforth, in England specifically, not the whole of the United Kingdom, we'll blur the distinction between committed Christians who happen to be in the parish church building and therefore allied with the state, and the whole parish, the idea of the cure of souls being responsible for the conversion and well-being of everyone in the locality. So the clergy have inherited a poisoned chalice. They are continually being told by their own political strategists and by the political classes in private that your job is to keep hearts and minds on side with the state agenda, even as they very well know from their own Bible study and what's left of their seminary training, which is pretty wretched compared with how it used to be a generation ago. They will know perfectly well that that is neither a biblical nor a historical nor even a logical position for what their role is.
Going back through the history, I mean, sadly, obviously, not going to be time to cover everything that's certainly within your range of knowledge. But you're absolutely right to point back to that, and I think I think there's that sense certainly that people who do still attend church or even don't, but it's kind of part of their consciousness will by and large be unaware of that. One of the things I was going to want to talk about is that not just the change to congregations, but also to clergy. I think it's observable that the type of person, this is perhaps unfair because by and large, this is perhaps done on appearance, but I think it might be fair to say that the type of person that represents the Church of England in this day and age is somewhat different from those people 50 years ago or even perhaps less. Do you think that they really are different people, not just in appearance but in their manifest beliefs and the motivations that have brought them into the church in the first place? If that is or isn't the case, why again would there be that change, transition, or apparent sort of point of disconnection?
Well, I think some of it is not even specific to spiritual or religious considerations, Charles. Very recently, you gave an illuminating discussion with Brian Gerrish, which I think likewise was going to turn out to be the first in a series on the question of the military. One of the core issues in that first episode of yours is what kind of people go forward for recruitment and more particularly for officership. And you were obviously at pains to stress the centrality of the tradition of military families. And although it's not a biblical practice, and some kinds of very committed Protestants have fulminated against it as being not spiritual, the historical reality has been that certain families supplied their sons or one of their sons generation by generation as well, there were various terms: the rector, the vicar, the incumbent, the priest in charge. I mean, these are all nuances depending on the legal structure of how the man in question came to fill the parish pulpit. But the man who preached, in very biblical terms, the elder of the congregation. This is the way that things were in supplying the army, but also the church. Of course, it can be rightly caricatured. There are times, such as the mid 18th century, when everyone was lax. The term at the time was latitudinarian, and thought, "Pah, as long as you do your duty, nobody really cares much about book learning or biblical accuracy." But that's how it was. And these families supplied a jolly high degree of backbone. They would stand up against weak bishops in very many cases and jealously guard their independence. I mean, to this day, when the new kind of bishops come in, often managerialist is the best word for them. They're the reshapers of society. They're ones who are, in a nice Dutch idiom, trying to keep all noses pointing the same way. When they decree that henceforth we will worship this way, or for the sake of openness and inclusivity, we'll no longer do that, these bloody-minded older men, which is what they almost always are, will know that they have a leg to stand on. They are part of a vanishing breed of men appointed for life, and apart from gross indecency, they can't be removed under canon law by the bishops. And they will say, no, what has gone on, and much of it is under cover of or mixed up with the bringing on board of women, first 30 years ago as clergy and then very recently as bishops, is that those who have been right to point out this trend towards managerialism and the idea of creating community as the key calling, and no biblical literacy or ministry to the comfortless. Um, such people have been accused of simply being dinosaurs or misogynists, but you can give the lie to that by comparing it with how, to give the two closest examples to the Church of England, the United Reformed Church, which is effectively two denominations that were close successors to the Puritans in England, the ones that didn't get on the boat and leave. Since the 1970s, they decided to ordain women, a position that I'm not personally in favour of, but they did so, and you still got the same solid, okay, you could quibble with details, but old-fashioned ministry to the congregation there. You didn't get a revolution overnight. Likewise, the Church of Scotland, from if memory serves, 1969, I think it was, onwards, the established church north of the border did the same thing. And again, there was not the same immediacy of revolutionary change or takeover that you saw there. Now, it has to be said that both of those examples, the English URC and the Presbyterian Church in Scotland are, by their founding documents, opposed to the idea of bishops. There is no hierarchy above the local minister in those denominations except a national synod. But be that as it may, something specific clearly went on in England, specifically with the established church, the Church of England, to mount some kind of coup d'etat. And the arrival of women, both as clergy and then very recently as bishops, and now it seems as archbishops, one's now come in Wales, and probably Canterbury will get one too. That is being used as the smokescreen, I think, to cover up the complete revolution that's going on.
Revolution seems exactly the right word for it. And actually, interesting that you brought up the armed forces or the military, referencing the conversation that I had with Brian recently. Military Matters, it's called, for anyone who's not quite certain, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes as well. But funnily enough, that's opposite, because one of the things I was going to talk about, insofar as the superficial, at least superficial hypocrisy of it, is the messaging that's gone on around what they're describing as the preparation for war. And it was Hugh Nelson, who's now bishop, recently appointed Bishop of Worcester and Bishop to the Armed Forces, and he spoke out saying that, well, first of all, telegraphing the fact that he absolutely believes that we are about to go to war, but also that the church should step up, not let people down in the way that he perceived that they did during the COVID event. And I found that fascinating. That's been followed up at General Synod by a brigadier in the chaplaincy service, Brigadier Marn, who finished his talk by saying that whilst the church is sometimes overlooked, it is always there in times of need. And I found that spectacularly ironic. Um, Perhaps not in a military context, because to be fair, chaplains do turn up, and they, certainly in my personal experience, they were people of good substance, and they were in the right place at the right time, and I would go along with that. But interesting that Nelson would specifically cite the COVID event alongside the preparation for war, and it's so easy to point over the last just the last 5 years alone, the many instances in which the church have been almost willfully blind to what might be going on in the minds of those people that really are part of the congregation. And that level of hypocrisy, to me, seems like something that would not have characterized the church that you've been describing through the ages.
No, very much not, because the understanding was there for centuries that the parish was the basic unit. Now, whether you're talking established churches around Europe, Roman Catholic, Church of England, various kinds of Lutheran or Calvinist, or whether you're talking nonconformists, that's the Baptists, Methodists, and others, there's always been agreement that that is the case. The devil's in the details, if you'll pardon the pun. Uh, Parish is not actually the oldest New Testament Greek term for a local gathering of Christians, paroikia in Greek, and even an older one from where we get the word diocese, that is the seat, or see, S-E-E, of a bishop and his seat of authority. That's an even older word. Dioikesis in the Greek New Testament and related terms are etymologically, they're the concept of the believers and their elders who oversee them, their episkopoi, which is the word where we get episcopacy or bishops. They go from house to house, a term that you will find frequently in the New Testament in any Bible translation, not to check up on each other, but to comfort and exhort one another, to learn from each other, to worship, to break bread together, read the scriptures together. So the diocese historically is a very, very old term, but the term is, I would say, hijacked. I don't think that malice by individual bishops is at play. I mean, you've got huge amounts of history to contend with here, such as the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, so that the clergy were the only men left standing who could save Western Europe from anarchy and disorder. But they end up taking on administration, even secular administration. And before you know it, they sit in a bishop's palace next to a cathedral and they have staff around them. That sounds very obscure because it's 1500 years ago, but it goes right through to the present and what you're talking about. Because anyone who within or from outside, but on behalf of a group of concerned parishioners, in the Church of England, anyone who knocks on the door of the diocesan office, so where the bishop and his staff hang out, is in for a couple of shocks from this historical legacy if they really pry into it. One is that the diocese, the bishop and his staff at headquarters in each region of England, you could say, it's not quite county, but more or less, they are a ring-fenced separate charity at law. I mean, there's more we could say about the Church of England and charity law. Many of our viewers will not know, for example, that the Charity Commission for England and Wales keeps extending an overdue period of grace with the Church of England to let them cook their own books. I'm sorry to be blunt there, but they do, because the current excuse by the Charity Commission is it's such a volume that we wouldn't be able to cope with the auditing. And there's this continual promise that eventually the Charity Commission will treat them like any other religious or secular charitable organization, but they don't. So the key point there on the charity law is the diocese, so the bishop and the staff in any town, the seat of the diocese of any shire, they are a separate charity at law. The salaries there, the stipends or whatever you want to call them, for the secular staff as well, like the lawyers and the PR people increasingly, they are separate flows from the parishioners' giving. The parishes are being leaned upon mightily to give their parish share. We've covered this in some UK column content. But if it all goes belly up, the diocesan staff are paid out of a different pot. So it rings hollow if they say we're all in this together. That's one of the things that shocks. Another is if you go to the diocesan staff and say the parish church in X has got a valid case that you not take any more of its giving into central coffers because the roof is leaking or whatever it may be, or they can't meet the latest onerous health and safety or safeguarding regulation. For our foreign viewers, safeguarding is the ubiquitous British term now for suspecting everyone of child abuse until proven otherwise. The first thing the diocesan office will, no, not the first thing, the last thing, if you really push them, will be that they will grudgingly admit that they are all there for His Grace the Bishop. They are not there to serve the parish with decent legal advice or to put their interests first. It's a bit like HR in a corporation. They're there to cover the backsides of the men and women increasingly in authority over that structure at the episcopal, the diocesan level. Well, I could go on about that further, but those are a couple of the things that repeatedly campaigners, in the positive sense of the word, I'm not being snotty about them, campaigners within the Church of England will find that they really are on their own within the institution, even though it's universally acknowledged that the building was built by the blood, sweat, and tears of countless prior generations, and nobody, even the most deceitful lawyerly type within the structure, has ever claimed that that building exists because some central authority willed it to be so. It's not like a school or a library built by a municipal or national authority or even EU taxpayers' money or whatever it may have been. The Church of England and indeed other established churches around, like the Church of Scotland, are nakedly stealing some of these buildings now when they put them up for sale to the highest bidder. And I'm afraid to say a lot of nonconformist denominations in England, the Baptists and Methodists in particular, are guilty of the same in recent decades, going completely over the head of the parishioners. This is not just a matter of principle, it's an actionable matter of law, trust law. Because even if the word trust is not used in some of the key documents, the grants and testaments which prop up the money of a local congregation, whether it's a parish or a nonconformist one, trust law, if fairly operated in the courts, will always say these people hold their building and their funds in trust from previous to future generations of the same local worshipping congregation. No hierarchy has got a look in using those funds or hypothecating them for a grand project.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, Alex. I mean, I want to come on to the area of finance, but this will strike a massive chord with anyone who has any involvement at the parochial church council level or has had any dealings with the diocesan administration, because it is absolutely the case, and I can say that with a degree of authority from admittedly an anecdotal perspective, but I am involved at that level, and that is precisely what I do see. So you are totally correct to make that point, and I think I would go slightly further, perhaps sort of sideways, in terms of the way in which the appointed priest will deal with some of this, which I think can, in many cases, be to forget that they are indeed the incumbent, and as such, they have specific and particular responsibilities for the period of their tenure. But that does not mean that it is that that physical building, that entity, that church becomes their possession with which to do as they choose, and therefore the degree of influence, which is exactly what you're talking about, the degree of influence to which the either the incumbent, the priest in charge, or indeed the diocese should have over the future of the church building should be extremely limited. But I think this is increasingly forgotten because of the structures that you describe. And what I really want to get onto is the bigger picture in terms of finance, because as you say, I mean, find me a church in the land that doesn't have a leaking roof, or sort of broken floor tiles or something like that, where they're constantly calling on the same people to put their hands in their pockets at the same time as the church commissioners sit on 10.4 billion pounds. Now, I dare say UK column viewers and listeners will be to a certain extent aware of this, and I've written a couple of articles about the investment policies of the church commissioners. But to set some context, that number, that figure of what is now 10.4 billion, increased by 1 billion during 2020, which is an absolutely staggering statistic. Not only that, but despite their, well, at least what they call their ethical investment policy, they are restricted, but only to a point, concerning investments in things like pornography or embryonic stem cell research, or indeed the production of weapons that are specifically designed to kill. And there's obvious contradiction. I mean, enormous contradiction here, as well as we could go on. I mean, they espouse to be pursuing net zero, whatever exactly that's meant to mean this week, at the same time as being able to invest in thermal coal. So the whole thing is a complete nonsense. And in fact, now, just to take it back to the parish level, there are now funds made available to parochial church councils. They can invest in them, but the investment criteria are the same. So you might find unwittingly, because people have a tendency not to read this sort of detail, that many parishes are investing their money in exactly the sorts of things that, to my mind, the church shouldn't be touching with a barge pole. But what I want to get to, really, going backwards, is that it is hard to see now how the church could operate as it does without the enormous sums of money it does sit on. My question to you is, why should a church hold vast sums of money? Uh, and I mean, I mean that sort of in a practical sense, but also with relationship to history and indeed scriptural interpretation. What is your view on the use of money in this capacity in the first place?
I'll take the second half of that excellent question first, because there's a single verse of St. Paul in Scripture that talks about it. At the end of his first epistle to Timothy, which is specifically giving directions for how the church is to be governed by elders and the other titles that exist in the early church, Paul says that one of the main pitfalls is that the love of money is the root of all evil. In New Testament Greek, ritzagar panton kakun he philarguria. So a couple of things to say about that. There's no article there in the Greek, so it can also validly be translated is a root of all kinds of evil. Clearly, philosophically, if you use your noddle, there are many sins and high crimes that are committed without pecuniary gain in mind. And secondly, the word for all in Greek there can also mean all kinds of, all manner of, endless. So Paul is, in one sense, saying whatever category of sin you might find in the church or the world, it may well be occasioned by this money-grabbing tendency. But that is just an ongoing given of our fallen world, and one that Paul in 1 Timothy enjoins the church, particularly its clergy, to understand the reality of and to mitigate the risks of prayerfully and vigilantly. Now, the first half is what about the first half of your question was what about this accruing of vast wealth? Well, that's a perennial issue. I mean, within the very large, decent parts of the Roman Catholic Church, over a vast area of time and space that it's existed, this has been one of the philosophical objections. The humanists of the same generation as Martin Luther, who wouldn't go along with his decision to leave the hierarchy and start again, men such as Desiderius Erasmus, were very, very hot on this. Even before the Reformation, men called the morning stars of the Reformation because they were the first Bible translators into the vernacular in their countries, and that they weren't able to spark a Reformation. They suffered heavily for it, but they started the ball rolling in the 13th and 14th centuries. Men like Jan Hus in Bohemia and John Wycliffe in England were already fingering particularly this point of priests and monks. Let's not forget all the monastic life as well. In some cases, living it up, and in other cases, simply be living fairly soberly, but sitting on massive piles of gold. Nowhere more so, by the way, than in Britain, where against a continental average of something like a fifth of the arable land being church possession, it was on the eve of the Reformation in England a quarter, and in Scotland, where good land is at a real premium, something up to a third of the land being owned by the church. Well, how did this happen? You've got to blame naive Christians in some sense, because the well-to-do or those who'd suddenly come into money and fortune in their life in those years, the centuries leading up to the Reformation, would, in vague terms, leave a lot of their wealth to the church or some central authority or hub, such as a monastery. And all that we've said so far about the church being the local worshipping body of believers, biblically and at canon law, that goes out of the window if the money has, by a secular deed of trust law, gone to the church in the sense of what now is called the church commissioners. They weren't called that then, but the men at the centre who hold the purse strings of the national or regional wealth. You cannot mitigate that in law. You have to have a clean slate, really, or set a mental break from that and ask yourself, what do we do at local level with the funds still coming through? One of the key insights I've gleaned from my father on this broad issue is that whether you're talking secular terms in the City of London or religious terms, particularly with the Church of England, the insight of the men that govern us is always that the little people's accrued money power is still more trillions, more orders of magnitude than the big guys and the big institutions. The fight, the really grubby mitts fight, is still for the fresh flows, small, but endlessly multiplied across time and space and generations of giving that come in. And this came to a point in the second half of the 20th century as the Church of England collapsed. I wouldn't even say downgraded, but gave up biblical positions on every area of life, notably sexuality, decade after decade. One of the three big parties of churchmanship or conviction in the Church of England, alongside the Anglo-Catholic or High Church and the liberal in the old sense of social gospel, was the evangelical wing. That is what you might call the Bible bashers from outside. And their nominated leaders, to use that dreaded term again, did go beating a path to, if memory serves, Archbishop Robert Runce's door in the early 80s, the Thatcher era, and made yet another idle threat that if the parishes and the evangelical individuals we represent are not satisfied that you're using your money responsibly and not frittering it away on national policy or even arms sales or whatnot, we will up sticks and walk. And Runcie, being a wise man, not particularly an excellent one, but he knew what was going on and said, well, if you're making this idle threat, then don't say it, do it. You can only do it once. And that shut them up. Because going back two decades before that to the mid-60s, with the famous confrontation between Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones and John Stott over whether evangelicals should be in the Church of England or even any biblically minded people of any particular persuasion, the whole issue was, do we stay in and seek to influence this behemoth, or do we come out? Well, frankly, that argument was already made in blood and torture and exile 2 centuries before that in England, even more powerfully in Scotland in the killing times. And it had already crystallized through emigration, Puritanism, decisions to stay or leave the Church of England. It was all shutting the stable door after the horse had bolted by the mid-20th century. But the point I'm making here is, through all of that time, a large number of prominent men who would like to go by the credentials of solidly evangelical and biblical set themselves up as the anointed and appointed leaders of evangelical Anglicanism. In some cases, even the term Reformed Anglicanism is used. Within England, I'm talking about. It's radically different in, for example, the Archdiocese of Sydney in Australia or some parts of Canada and New Zealand. But they continually said, we make idle threats to leave, and when the chips were down, when they were told by an archbishop or a prime minister, well, off you go and do it then and become disestablished, they decided inevitably that respectability and positions of influence were more important than that. And these are the networks of people who tried to tap me up when I was at Cambridge, through whom I may have eventually become something big in the Church of England if my conscience had been wired rather differently than it actually is.
Yeah, I mean, I'd meant to comment on your reference to that earlier in the discussion, because I think it seems far less outlandish to consider that you might have been Archbishop of Canterbury than it does to consider that Justin Welby did actually become Archbishop of Canterbury with his background. It still does seem very discordant. But just to stick on the idea of money, and you were talking about exerting influence, and funnily enough, that's more or less exactly the phrase that the church commissioners use with regard to their current portfolio of equity holdings, because they are heavily invested at the moment in the microchip business pertaining to artificial intelligence and in effect enabling that through the amounts of money that they're dedicating to it, as well as being very much invested in Amazon. And their explanation for this is that it's better to be able to exert influence by being in the room. That's the phrase they used, in the room. Of course, they are unable to point to a single instance where they've changed the course of any of these vast tankers as they navigate their way across the seas to greater and greater profits and control and all the rest of it. But I think the question is, I referred to what they describe as an ethical investment policy. In church terms, I mean, it is the idea of ethical investment a contradiction in terms?
I think you won't find a single verse in Scripture, Old or New Testament, that will answer that cleanly for us. And more to the point, many whole passages of Scripture, whole chapters in both Old and New Testament, and to complete Thomas Hooker's triad, the use of tradition and reason in the church as well, which is the classic foundation of Anglicanism. You use them in that descending order of hierarchy. Scripture, tradition, and reason will tell us, if we put our mind to it, that because money is a means of exchange, okay, it's subverted into many other things in the age of fiat currency, but because it's a representation of people's value in the true sense of what they'll bleed for, what they'll spend their time for, what they'll wreck their health for, obviously there is going to be so much human motive and so many mixed motives and so much impurity, uh, uh, marbled with nobility in all of these decisions around money. The only clear pointers we have in the New Testament in particular is that money given to the church in the biblical sense of the worshipping local body, or if you want also to include a synod, a group of churches overseeing each other in the biblical and historical way, the money is there for diaconal purposes. So that's another Greek word we have to look at in the New Testament. Diakonos is a general ancient Greek word for a servant. Not the only word used in the New Testament for a servant. There's also huperetes, which is more like an attendant, a noble servant, one who serves with thought. A diakonos, not to do it down, but it's a practical role. You can read in chapters 6 and 7 of the book of Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament precisely why that church office was hived off from that of elders, so that the men involved could dedicate themselves to seeing to the practical needs. But here's the thing, of whom? The whole New Testament, not just that passage, but the whole New Testament makes it abundantly clear that you take care of the household of God first. If you don't provide for your own people within the family or within the local congregation, you are, as Paul says again to Timothy and to Titus, you're worse than an unbeliever, you're an infidel. So the diaconal role, the role of deacons in the church, the reason for church collections, the reason why there's a kitty, physical or now digital, at local level from which you can give a share now up to the center, which is what we're talking about when it all goes wrong. The reason is only biblically and historically that there are weak and infirm people in your midst who are genuinely unable to provide for themselves. Set against that, as Paul writes to Titus, is that if a man, and it's deliberately a male person, if a man is unwilling to work, he shouldn't be allowed to eat, in the sense of don't give him a handout from church coffers. So there is the question of the deserving poor here. I mean, in the Dutch Reformed setup that I have ended up with, they take that to a logical extreme, not a bad one, I don't think, whereby they actually make use of the conscientious objection provision that Dutch law has, not to insure themselves, even their basic health insurance or car insurance in some cases. But it's not anarchy or irresponsible to their neighbours, because when something does happen, like a bad car accident or an expensive course of treatment is needed, the entire church, nationally if needed, will hold a whip round and in no time will get €500,000 together for the need. So that your liability is covered there. That is the biblical sense of why money is collected. Paul gives detailed instructions in his first epistle to the Corinthians in the middle chapters. He says, I'm passing through your city again to give you some fresh instruction. Don't have a frenzied, sudden whip round when I come, but every time you meet on the first day of the week, have a collection for the poor. That's the only real New Testament sense in which money and the church go together. For Christ said himself, my kingdom is not of this world. So that means not only no weapons held by church officers, but no political influence wielded by them either, regardless of where you stand in the whole spectrum of how political should Christians be, on which there's been centuries of philosophical argument, of course.
Yes, well, I think that's something that what you've just articulated is certainly not to be found in the text of the Church Commissioners Act 1947. It's a very obviously sort of veered off at a significant tangent, and I think what I'd like to do, we've covered a lot of ground, and I think sort of we're setting a really important context insofar as the history and scripture is concerned. I think just to turn our focus to what we have in front of us, and indeed, therefore, to point to obviously a hypothetical future because none of us really knows what's going to happen. But it is interesting, given what you say about church collections for the poor, the needy, the deserving poor. I can't see that anybody would disagree with that. And yet, we see that congregations have dwindled. We see that people have turned away from churches. We see that, ironically, at least on the face of it, people decry the fact that British culture, English culture is being dissolved, eroded, degraded, and with the very significant impact that recent and, one might say, torrential migration has brought about is, of course, an influx of new cultures, new faiths. Well, when I say new, I mean different. And people are apparently at the same time lamenting the fact that another faith might be showing, let's say, dominance where Christianity or indeed the Church of England isn't. And yet, what doesn't seem possible to discern is that people are coming together as church congregations and actually doing anything about this. And your point is well made about leadership at the start. I think that is a very important point to make. But then again, it's perfectly possible for particularly bishops who do have a sort of effectively a public facing, a public role, to set a moral or spiritual example, which I would say is sort of as distinct from leadership in the way that you were referring to it earlier. Do you think that there is a point at which, or a situation in which, people will gravitate back towards the church and these sorts of concepts of money going in the right direction and helping the sorts of people that, of course, have not been looked after at community or church level and therefore have become, in effect, victims of the state welfare system? When one thinks about it on a very simplistic level, there are so many things that could be taken care of in one fell swoop if the Church of England as an organisation and indeed at parish level worked as it was supposed to and was supported by the majority of people living within the parishes that do have churches. I don't know whether I'm being too idealistic or optimistic. What are your thoughts on sort of where we are now and where it could go? And in a way, so as I say, the irony of the situation in which people seem to be articulating the problem, but at the same time, perhaps not realizing that they are part of the solution, yet they're not being drawn towards it.
We have all the historical models, both in the church and in, shall we say, adjacent institutions like building societies in which British Christians, nonconformists in this case, led the world to solve this issue. Uh, if we don't want to sully ourselves, our reputations, or even our liberty now by handling money in an increasingly totalitarian model where we'll be accused of funding terrorism or whatnot if we pay for each other outside the system values, we can easily set up at local level or even further afield something like a time bank where we put in hours and our skills to assist each other. I mean, you don't need to be a Christian or even any kind of believer to understand this. Many of the people who've implemented it have been principled atheists in various countries around the world. It's a thoroughly biblical approach. The injunction that several of the apostles give in the New Testament in several ways to the fledgling churches is that one ought to, in full vigor, particularly a duty upon men, one ought to be earning enough or have enough resources, if we want to definancialize the concept, have enough skills and time that one not only can provide for one's own, in the immediate sense, wife and children and ailing elderly relatives or whatever, but also to have something left, as Paul put it at one point, for those who are in need. That is within the local body of believers, adherents. So this can easily, simply be done. Now, in institutional terms, if a congregation decides that it's still theologically Anglican, still committed to that interpretation of the Reformation and of church history and biblical interpretation and authority and hierarchy, but thinks literally to hell with the current archiepiscopal model and all that it hangs on to it in terms of the underbelly of the state, there are ways to go. There is one shining example in England of what was done there. It was the late Reverend Melvin Tinker in Hull, one of the most godless cities in the whole world. Certainly, I'd say a strong contender for the most godless major city in England, who had the gumption some years ago at the end of his earthly life to lean upon his congregation, who said yes, to come out of the Church of England legally. This was a large, evangelical, non-heretical, no funny ideas congregation that simply did it. Stuck, politely speaking, two fingers up at Canterbury, Westminster, and everyone in between, and said, we are Anglicans, but we're no longer the established church in this locality. The building is ours, the people are ours, the money is ours, you can whistle for it. And at law, in common sense and morally, they were entirely borne out. There's also one case in Scotland of the closest parallel, the established Church of Scotland. As I said earlier, no bishops there in that established church, but roughly similar at law. That's the Reverend Willie Phillip at what was called St George's Tron in Glasgow, now simply called the Tron Church. They did have to leave their building, very unjustly, of course, because they'd paid for everything like a new organ, and it had to be forfeited to the Church of Scotland. But they likewise said, we are Church of Scotland, we are Presbyterians of the established type in Scotland, but we do not want to be associated with this wicked state and its sexual policies in the church anymore. And they did it. It can be done institutionally, and as I was saying a moment ago, in terms of giving. In fact, more to the point than that, there were centuries in the early church, under the persecutions of early Roman emperors, where Christians not just had the option to, but were obliged to use, frankly, black market, barter, and time bank methods to help each other out. There were blacklists from the professions back then. There were places, sometimes for protracted periods, where Christians officially couldn't get any kind of employment, but they survived by the grace of God precisely by having these kinds of attitudes. What's holding us back at the moment is that this damned quest, wretched quest for respectability socially, which even some of the key authors within evangelical Anglicanism, like Oliver Berkeley, have frankly admitted in their books, was both, you could say, the strength, but also the downfall of Anglicanism in the latter half of the 20th century. This determination that we will be given our place in the sun by this state and by its bien-pensant, by the great and good. That's what's led them to be supine through all the successive waves of sexual and other degeneracy and wickedness that have crept into the church. And if that's addressed, as it has been locally by some, yes, there is every prospect of caring for one's own.
Yeah, it's it's really well put, and I think it's heartening. And I think that what I would come back to, of course, is that really, if you're looking at it as somebody who's either considering going into the church or already involved, this time should really be seen as a tremendous opportunity. The number of areas in which we could rattle through and suggest that either the controlling influences have pushed people off track or society has gone off track. However you actually decide you're wanting to explain it, the point is that there is a very very obvious role for the church there, and to take the sorts of actions that you've just been describing. I mean, it's still remarkable to me that we live in an age where the Church of England will say that they will not conduct same-sex marriages, but that they will conduct marriages for people who don't routinely go to church or belong to a congregation, or indeed have no faith at all. And rather remarkably, they will conduct marriages in church for people who belong to a different faith, and even for people who hold a gender recognition certificate. So it is possible to do all of those things, but not be married if you're part of the, if two people belong to the same sex. I mean, the number of inconsistencies in these sorts of issues are just seemingly endless, and I think still a point of enormous um, incomprehension to people who look on and can't quite consider how it is that we could have got to this point. But I think you point, by citing those examples, I think you point to a way in which the church can assume, in a genuine sense, a much greater degree of relevance in people's lives, if only the right people would, in effect, sort of stick their head above the parapet and say the right things. I think what we've covered so far in the discussion today is a great introduction to this. I mean, clearly, absolutely vast topic. What I would just ask you to do with what I've just said in mind about the presentation of an opportunity and in a way, you know, the sort of cometh the hour suggestion. You, as you said right at the beginning, you've been involved very closely with, let's say, the church in the wider sense. I mean, obviously, you're not in the United Kingdom, so your knowledge of the Church of England is clearly very deep, and a lot of that's based on personal experience. But from what you are seeing in the circles within which you, well, not necessarily move, but the people you're in touch with, do you see a generation of people coming forward who might be taking the mantle and making these sorts of changes, proclamations, and everything else?
Definitely. And until a couple of years ago, I would have said, not with an axe to grind, but as a regretful truth, that very few of them were ethnically English. This was something I would bewail, but also accept with my whole coterie of friends, that there may be impeccable Anglican congregations chanting Coverdale Psalms and all the other things you would expect in the various shades of churchmanship, evangelical, high church, in the future, but they wouldn't be white people. They would be yellow, brown, and black skinned people. And I'm not making a moral point there, but it's just a forecast that we were making, because there was very little gumption to be seen in, shall we say, traditional English evangelicalism or Anglicanism in any of its settings. That is changing. And as other commentators have started to notice in the past year, it's changing particularly in the biggest urban areas in England. And it's not just the case now that, to use the old cliches but true ones, you've got vibrant Afro-Caribbean or West African or ethnic Chinese or ethnic Korean congregations mushrooming, although they certainly do, and many of them have appropriated serious historical Anglicanism and its theology with far more gusto than the native English have. But by this point, we do see a lot of, to use the new jargon, Gen Z or even Gen Alpha young men in particular, aiming to be scholarly, erudite, self effacing, and in the true older sense of the word, leaders I mean, to close the circle I began with, I would say that this kind of man would be described in other languages like Russian using the native words for leaders and not the one borrowed from English, lider, which kind of makes it transparent that another concept, one being pushed from English speaking countries, is being meant. You know, the old idea of laying down your life and giving your best for the flock. Yes, I do think that quite a few of the young men that we see are determined to, in the old sense, take holy orders, or be, this would be another discussion, but to become lay readers. That is, men who are licensed by the bishop, and there's the bottleneck, they're unwilling to do it at bishop level, but who are recognized and licensed to do everything that an ordained clergyman can do except administer the sacraments, baptism, and the Lord's Supper, or Eucharist as it would be called, or communion in Anglican circles. These lay readers, for which you should see E7 and E8 in the Church of England canon law, easily found online, they are the obvious solution to this. But with them, and even with ordaining regular clergy, some of the bishops in the Church of England have, since the 90s, already been seeing which way the wind is blowing and saying, I will not ordain or I will not license as a lay reader any of these hotheads who actually believe the Bible. So, yes, there are bottlenecks. It may require, as previously discussed, some of the parishes to leave the Church of England, but in Anglicanism and wider afield in English Christianity, I do not think all is lost.
And on that note, Alex, I think we have to capture that particular moment because that is a really positive place to come back to, and it does exactly like you say. It links right back to the beginning. We've covered, I would say, a lot of ground, but at the same time, scratch the surface, and there will be a lot more to talk about. But I think that's a great place to start and to draw this particular discussion to a close and have a think about what we might go on to explore in future. So, Alex, thank you very much indeed for joining me. I've enjoyed that enormously, as I hope you have. And I would just say to anyone listening or watching, there will be links in the show notes to all the various UK column content that we've referred to, and indeed other resources. If you've ended up listening to or watching this somewhere other than the UK column website and you want to know more about what we do and indeed how you might support us as a member, then please go to ukcolumn.org. But I think we'll leave it there, and I'll just close out by saying thank you very much indeed, Alex, and I look forward to the next one.
Thank you very much indeed, Charles.